boy returns from death with a shocking message from Jesus. The rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors suddenly turned into a single, piercing tone. Through the haze of bright lights and frantic voices, I could see my own body lying motionless on the hospital bed. My father, Kevin, collapsed into a chair, his face buried in his hands, while my mother, Beth, clutched her stomach where she carried my unborn sibling, a secret she hadn't yet shared with anyone. Time of death, 3:47 p.m. Dr. Hawthorne's voice cut through the chaos. But I wasn't gone. I was floating above them all, watching as nurses rushed around my lifeless body, as my father's shoulders shook with silent sobs, as my mother whispered prayers through her tears. That's when I saw them beings of pure light, their wings shimmering with colors I had never seen on earth. They reached out to me, not with hands, but with love itself, and suddenly I was moving through a tunnel of the most beautiful light imaginable. It wasn't harsh or blinding, it felt like being wrapped in a warm embrace. As I moved further away from my earthly body, I could hear my mother's desperate prayers becoming fainter. Please, Lord, don't take my boy. Please. But ahead of me, a different voice called gentle, loving, familiar, though I had never heard it before. It was his voice. The next thing I remember was gasping for air in my hospital bed. 2 months later, my eyes flying open as the monitors burst back to life. The room erupted in shocked exclamations, but I barely heard them. My first words weren't about pain or fear. Instead, I looked straight into my father's tear-filled eyes and whispered, "Daddy, I saw Jesus. He said to tell you heaven is real and Sarah says hello." The room fell silent. My parents exchanged shocked glances. They had never told me about Sarah, my sister who died before I was born. Dr. Hawthorne stood frozen in the doorway, his clipboard slipping from his fingers. In that moment, none of us knew that my return from death would spark a journey that would challenge not just one man's skepticism, but the very foundations of faith and science in our small Ohio town. And so began the story that would change not just my life, but the lives of thousands of others, a story of death and life, doubt and belief, tragedy and triumph, a story that would test the limits of faith, love, and the power of truth. This is my testimony, not just of heaven, but of how a 6-year-old boy's journey beyond death brought hope to the hopeless and light to those lost in darkness. Most importantly, it's a story about the message he gave me, a message that would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about life, death, and the eternal love that bridges the two. If this glimpse into my journey between worlds has stirred your soul, join our growing family of believers. Subscribe now to unlock the full story of heaven's truth, miracles, and the message that changed thousands of lives forever. Growing up in small-town Ohio, we were what you'd call a picture-perfect American family. My father, Kevin Malarkey, was a devoted Christian and successful real estate agent whose booming laugh could fill our entire church hall. Every Sunday morning, he'd lift me onto his shoulders as we walked up the chapel steps, telling me I was closer to heaven up there. If only we'd known how prophetic those words would become. My mother, Beth, was the kind who could smell a scraped knee before you even started crying. She had this way of humming hymns while cooking dinner, her voice mixing with the sizzle of whatever was in the pan. I remember how she'd always set an extra place at the table for unexpected blessings, she'd say. Looking back now, I wonder if she somehow knew about the baby she was carrying, the sibling I'd learned about in the most extraordinary way. Our lives intersected with Dr. Richard Hawthorne the day of my accident, though his presence in our story was destined long before that. Chief of pediatric care at Memorial Hospital, he was known as much for his brilliant medical mind as for his unwavering skepticism of anything spiritual. "Faith is a crutch for those who can't face reality," he once told a local newspaper. His office walls were lined with degrees and awards, but notably absent was the family photo most doctors displayed. Few knew about the wife he'd lost to cancer 5 years earlier, leaving him alone to raise their daughter, Emily. I was 6 years old then, full of questions about everything under the sun. Why is the sky blue, I'd ask during car rides? Did Adam and Eve have belly buttons during Sunday school? My father loved my curiosity, always taking time to explain things from both a scientific and spiritual perspective. God gave us minds to understand His world, he'd say, and hearts to understand His love. Our church, the Grace Community Chapel, was more than just a place of worship, it was our extended family. Pastor Michael Stevens, with his silver hair and kind eyes, had baptized me as a baby. Mrs. Anderson, who taught Sunday school, always saved the blue cookies just for me because she knew they were my favorite. Even Mr. Thompson, the grumpy church janitor, would slip me candy when he thought no one was looking. But there was one aspect of our family history that remained unspoken, a shadow that lingered beneath our seemingly perfect life. Sarah, my sister who lived for only 2 days before returning to heaven, was never mentioned. Her tiny grave in the church cemetery bore only a date and the words "beloved daughter." I didn't know about her then. None of us could have imagined how her story would intertwine with mine in the most miraculous way. Life had a comfortable rhythm back then. School days filled with spelling tests and playground adventures, family dinners where Dad would make us laugh until milk came out of our noses, and quiet evenings when Mom would read Bible stories while I fought sleep, determined to hear how each one ended. We were happy, secure in our faith and in each other. What none of us realized was how quickly everything could change. We didn't know that Dr. Hawthorne's daughter would soon be diagnosed with an aggressive form of leukemia, the same disease that took his wife. We couldn't have guessed that Mom was carrying a secret inside her, a new life that would become part of our miracle. And we had no way of knowing that our simple family story was about to become a testament to God's love that would touch thousands of lives. Sometimes I think about that last normal morning, how Dad made pancakes shaped like angels and Mom kissed both our foreheads before heading to her prayer group. If we'd known what was coming, would we have done anything differently? Would we have held each other a little longer, prayed a little harder? But then I remember what Jesus told me during my time in heaven: every moment is part of God's perfect plan, even the ones that break our hearts. This was our family, imperfect, faithful, and about to be tested in ways we could never imagine. Through my eyes as a 6-year-old boy, our world was safe and certain. But God had bigger plans for us all, plans that would begin to unfold on a crisp autumn morning when Dad decided to take me for a drive. The morning of October 14th, 2004 dawned like any other, but something felt different. Maybe it was the way the autumn light filtered through my bedroom window, or how Mom lingered a little longer when she hugged me goodbye. I remember standing at our kitchen window watching the maple leaves dance in the wind when Dad suggested we take a drive together. I was a typical 6-year-old in most ways. My room was a chaos of superhero figures and Bible storybooks. I loved how Batman fought evil, but I loved Jesus stories even more. Every night I'd make Dad read from my children's Bible, always begging for just one more story. Even as my eyes grew heavy, my favorite was always about David and Goliath. I liked how the little guy won through faith. That fall, I had just started first grade at Lincoln Elementary. My teacher, Miss Thompson, said I asked more questions than any student she'd ever had. Why do clouds stay up in the sky? Does God have a favorite color? How do angels fly without airplanes? Sometimes my questions made the other kids laugh, but Miss Thompson never minded. She'd just smile and say, "Curiosity is God's gift to us, Alex." At church, I was known as the kid who couldn't sit still during Pastor Stephen's sermons. I'd wiggle and squirm, earning gentle pokes from Mom until Dad would slip me a piece of peppermint candy to keep me quiet. But when it came time for children's choir, I stood perfectly still, singing "Jesus Loves Maine" with all my heart. Mrs. Wilson, our choir director, always said I had the voice of an angel. How could I have known then how prophetic those words would become? The week before the accident, something extraordinary happened that we didn't understand until later. I started having dreams about a girl with golden hair who looked a lot like Mom. In these dreams, she would wave to me from a beautiful garden but never spoke. When I told Mom about the dreams, she got very quiet and left the room. I didn't know then that I was seeing Sarah, my sister, in heaven. Our life had its routines that felt as solid as the church foundation. Every Monday, Mom hosted Bible study in our living room. Tuesdays were for my t-ball practice, where Dad coached our team with more enthusiasm than skill. Wednesdays meant church potluck dinners, where I'd stuff myself with Mrs. Johnson's famous mac and cheese while the adults talked about grown-up things I didn't understand. Mom had been acting different lately, though. She was tired more often, disappearing to the bathroom in the mornings. Dad would give her these worried looks when he thought I wasn't watching. I didn't know she was carrying my future sister Grace, whose existence would become part of the miracle that was about to unfold. That morning, as Dad suggested our drive, Mom was at her prayer group. She had kissed us both goodbye, her hand lingering for a moment on her stomach, a gesture I wouldn't understand until much later. Take care of each other, she'd said, something she always told us when we left the house. but this time her voice had trembled slightly. I grabbed my favorite action figure, a plastic Jesus that my Sunday school teacher had given me, which always made Dad chuckle, and climbed into the car. The air was crisp with autumn promise, and Dad had turned on the radio to our favorite Christian station. "Oh Happy Day" was playing, and we were both singing at the top of our lungs. If I close my eyes now, I can still see Dad's smile in the rearview mirror, still feel the warmth of the sun through the car window, still hear our off-key singing mixing with the rustle of fallen leaves. We were just a father and son on a morning drive, unaware that in mere minutes our ordinary world would be transformed into something extraordinary. We didn't know that God was about to use our family's story to touch countless lives. We couldn't have imagined that our simple drive would become the beginning of a testimony that would strengthen the faith of thousands. Most of all, we had no idea that through the darkness that was about to envelop us, a light would shine that would change not just our lives, but the lives of everyone who would hear our story. In that moment, we were just driving through Ohio's back roads, a happy father and son on an autumn morning, minutes away from an event that would shake the foundations of everything we believed about life, death, and the power of faith. I remember every detail of that moment with a clarity that seems almost divine now. Dad and I were driving down Route 23, and I was telling him about how I wanted to be both a superhero and a preacher when I grew up. "You can save souls instead of cities," he'd laughed, his eyes crinkling at the corners in that way they always did when he was truly happy. The intersection of Maple and Pine was always busy, even on a Thursday morning. I was clutching my plastic Jesus figure, holding it up to catch the sunlight streaming through the window. The autumn trees were a blur of red and gold as we drove, and Dad had just reached over to turn up the volume on Amazing Grace, my mom's favorite hymn. "I saw the other car first." "Daddy," my voice came out as a high-pitched scream that I barely recognized as my own. A red pickup truck was barreling toward us, running the red light at full speed. The driver's head was down. I would later learn he was texting. I remember thinking how strange it was that time seemed to slow down, like in those movies Dad wouldn't let me watch yet. Dad tried to swerve, but there wasn't enough time. I watched his hands grip the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. I heard him whisper, "Jesus, protect my boy." The sound of his prayer was the last thing I heard before the impact. The crash itself was like nothing I could have imagined. The screech of metal on metal was deafening, but underneath it I could still hear Amazing Grace playing from our car's speakers, as if the hymn was trying to comfort us in our final moments together. Our car spun like a top, and my plastic Jesus figure flew from my hands. I remember reaching for it, even as my body was jerked violently by the impact. The windows shattered, sending a shower of glass that caught the sunlight like diamonds before everything started to turn. The world became a kaleidoscope of colors: the blue sky, the autumn trees, the gray pavement, all swirling together as our car flipped over and over. I felt weightless, like I was floating, even as my seatbelt dug into my chest. I saw Dad being thrown from the car, his body moving in slow motion through the broken windshield. I wanted to scream, to reach for him, but my voice wouldn't come. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was seeing my plastic Jesus figure landing softly in a pile of golden leaves, completely unbroken. The pain was both everywhere and nowhere. I felt like I was being pulled in 1,000 different directions at once, and then suddenly there was peace. A profound, complete peace that I had never experienced before. The kind of peace that Jesus would later tell me was the peace that surpasses all understanding. The sounds of the crash faded away, replaced by a silence that wasn't really silence at all. It was filled with something else, something like music, but more beautiful than any song I had ever heard. As my consciousness began to drift, I had one last earthly thought: Mom was going to be so sad about missing our family dinner tonight. They told me later that the first responders found me hanging upside down in my car seat, my body broken but my face peaceful. Dad was lying 30 feet away on the pavement, his hand stretched out toward the car, toward me. The plastic Jesus figure was found standing upright in those autumn leaves, without a scratch, as if it had been placed there deliberately. The last thing I remember before crossing over was a whisper, soft but clear as crystal: "Trust in the Lord with all your heart." It was my memory verse from Sunday school the previous week, but now it felt like more than just words. It felt like a promise. I didn't know then that this was just the beginning. I couldn't have known that my journey was about to take me to places beyond imagination, or that what happened next would challenge everything everyone thought they knew about life, death, and the thin line between the two. As my spirit began to separate from my broken body, I felt no fear. Instead, there was only anticipation, like the feeling you get on Christmas Eve, knowing something wonderful is about to happen. And something wonderful did happen, but that's the part of the story that nobody was ready to believe. The emergency room at Memorial Hospital erupted into controlled chaos as they wheeled my broken body through the doors. Through the strange in-between state I was experiencing, I could see everything with perfect clarity, the doctors rushing around, the nurses calling out numbers that meant nothing to me then, and Dr. Hawthorne's face as he took in the scene before him. 6-year-old male, multiple trauma. No pulse for the past 8 minutes, someone called out. I watched as they cut away my favorite Superman t-shirt, the one Mom had bought me just last week. Dr. Hawthorne's hands moved with practiced precision, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes hardened when he saw just how bad things were. "Where are the parents?" he barked, just as my mom burst through the emergency room doors. Her face was ashen, and both hands were clutched protectively over her stomach. Behind her, 2 nurses were wheeling my father in on another gurney, his body bloody but his lips moving in constant prayer. "Ma, I am. You need to wait outside." A nurse tried to guide Mom away, but she wouldn't budge. "That's my baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm pregnant. I haven't even told him he's going to be a big brother." The nurse's face softened with understanding, but protocol was protocol. They led her to the waiting room, where she collapsed into a chair, her Bible already in her hands. Meanwhile, I was experiencing something extraordinary. While my body lay lifeless on the table, I could see angels in the room, beautiful beings of light that moved among the medical staff. One stood next to Dr. Hawthorne, guiding his hands, though he didn't know it. Another hovered near my mother in the waiting room, its wings wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. Time of death, 3:47 p.m. Dr. Hawthorne's voice cut through the chaos. The words seemed to echo through the hospital corridors, followed by my mother's anguished cry from the waiting room. But I wasn't gone, not really. I was simply somewhere else, somewhere more real than anything I had ever known. The hospital staff began to step back from my body, their faces drawn with the particular sadness that comes from losing a child patient. Dr. Hawthorne stood frozen, his hand still positioned over my chest. I saw something flicker across his face, doubt perhaps, or the first crack in his armor of skepticism. One of the nurses touched his arm gently. Should I call it? But before he could respond, something happened that would change everything. A soft, golden light began to fill the room, a light that I could see from my elevated position, but that was invisible to everyone else. And in that light, I heard a voice, his voice saying words that would become the foundation of my testimony. "Not yet, little one. I have work for you to do." At that exact moment, my mother's voice rang out from the waiting room, crying out a verse from Psalms, "I shall not die, but live and declare the works of the Lord." The timing was no coincidence. She would later tell me she felt compelled to speak those words, though she didn't know why. Dr. Hawthorne was about to sign my death certificate when my body suddenly jerked on the table. The monitors, which had been showing flat lines, suddenly burst to life. The room erupted in shocked exclamations and renewed activity. "This is impossible," Dr. Hawthorne muttered, his scientific mind already trying to make sense of what he was seeing. But there was no scientific explanation for what was happening. There was only faith and the undeniable power of God's love. As they rushed to stabilize my newly revived body, no one noticed the single white feather that floated down from nowhere, landing softly on my chest. Later, when they would find it tucked into my hospital gown, Dr. Hawthorne would dismiss it as something that had fallen from a pillow. But Mom would keep that feather, knowing it was proof of the angels who had been present in that room. They didn't know then that this was just the beginning. They couldn't have known that my death and return would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of faith and science in our small town. Or that Dr. Hawthorne's carefully constructed world of scientific certainty was about to be turned upside down by a 6-year-old boy who had seen heaven. 2 weeks passed and I remained in a coma. From my ethereal vantage point, I watched the drama unfold in my hospital room like a story within a story. My body lay still, connected to a web of tubes and wires, while my spirit observed everything with perfect clarity. Dr. Hawthorne stood at the foot of my bed, his face grave as he addressed my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Malarkey, we need to discuss Alex's condition. The prolonged oxygen deprivation during the accident. The trauma." He paused, shuffling the papers on his clipboard. "We've seen no signs of brain activity." Mom sat beside my bed as she had every day, her Bible open on her lap and her hand resting protectively over her growing belly. Dad stood by the window, his normally strong frame looking somehow diminished in the harsh hospital lighting. "Are you suggesting we give up on our son?" Dad's voice was barely a whisper. "We're not giving up," Dr. Hawthorne replied, his clinical tone masking any emotion. "But we need to be realistic. The hospital ethics committee is meeting tomorrow to discuss Alex's case. Our resources are limited, and maintaining life support for a patient with no chance of recovery." "No chance," Mom's voice cracked. "Doctor, with God, there's always a chance." I watched Dr. Hawthorne's jaw tighten. "Mrs. Malarkey, I respect your faith, but I deal in medical facts. The machines are keeping Alex's body alive, but your son, the person you knew, he's gone." The news spread through our small town like wildfire. That evening, people began gathering outside the hospital, church members, school friends, even strangers who had heard our story. They brought candles and signs reading, "Pray for Alex and faith can move mountains." Pastor Stevens arrived, his silver hair gleaming in the fluorescent lights. "The entire congregation is fasting and praying," he told my parents. "We're not letting this boy go without a fight." Even Mr. Thompson, the grumpy church janitor, showed up with tears in his eyes. "That boy used to help me clean up after Sunday school," he said gruffly. "Always had a smile on his face. We can't let him pull the plug." The hospital administration was unsettled by the growing crowd. Dr. Hawthorne received calls from the board of directors concerned about the public relations nightmare brewing outside their doors, but he stood firm in his medical opinion. "I understand this is difficult," he told my parents that night, "but prolonging the inevitable isn't doing Alex any favors. The ethics committee meets at noon tomorrow. I need your decision by then." I wanted so desperately to tell them I wasn't gone, that I was right there with them. I tried to reach out to make them feel my presence, but the veil between worlds was too thick. Instead, I watched as my mother pulled out a small ultrasound picture from her Bible. "Kevin," she said softly to Dad, "I haven't told anyone else yet, but it's a girl. We're having a little girl." She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "Alex needs to meet his sister. He needs to be here to protect her, like he was meant to do for Sarah." Dad broke down then, tears streaming down his face. "Beth, what if the doctors are right? What if we're just prolonging his suffering because we can't let go?" "Then we'll have done everything we could," she replied firmly. "But I know in my heart he's still with us. I feel it every time I pray. We just need to give him time." The night grew deeper, and I watched as my parents finally fell asleep in the uncomfortable hospital chairs. Dr. Hawthorne made one final round, pausing at my door. For a moment his professional mask slipped, and I saw the pain in his eyes, the same pain I'd seen when he looked at old photos of his wife. "I'm sorry, kid," he whispered. "I wish I could believe in miracles like your parents do, but I've seen too much death to believe in fairy tales." Little did he know that his world was about to be turned upside down. As midnight approached, something stirred in the spiritual realm. The angels who had been constant companions during my coma gathered closer, their light growing stronger. "It's time," one of them said, "not in words but in pure thought. The Father needs a sign." Just then, Dad jolted awake from a dream. "Beth," he gasped, shaking Mom awake, "I saw him. I saw Alex. He was standing in a beautiful garden, and he wasn't alone. Sarah was with him. He told me to keep fighting." Mom's eyes filled with tears. "Kevin, we've never told him about Sarah. How could he know about her in your dream?" The first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the hospital room in shades of gold. In just a few hours, the ethics committee would meet to decide my fate. But something had shifted during the night, a spark of divine intervention that would change everything. Outside, the crowd of prayer warriors had grown larger, their voices rising in hymns that floated up to my window. Inside, my parents clung to each other in their newfound hope, while Dr. Hawthorne prepared to face a day that would challenge everything he thought he knew about medicine, faith, and the thin line between life and death. What none of them knew was that this was all part of a greater plan, a plan that would shake the foundations of their world and reveal the extraordinary power of faith, love, and the miracles that happen when we dare to believe in something greater than ourselves. Just hours before the ethics committee meeting, Dr. Hawthorne sat in his office, staring at his daughter Emily's test results. The numbers on the page blurred as tears threatened to spill from his eyes. Leukemia, the same disease that had taken his wife 5 years ago. His hands trembled as he set down the file. Daddy Emily stood in his doorway, her 12-year-old frame silhouetted against the hospital hallway lights. "Are you okay? You missed our breakfast date." He looked at his daughter so much like her mother, with those big brown eyes and gentle smile. How could he tell her? How could he watch another person he loved suffer through the same nightmare? "Come here, sweetheart," he managed, opening his arms. As she settled into his lap, just as she used to do when she was smaller, he caught a glimpse of my hospital room across the hall. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, preparing to advise, pulling life support from someone else's child while facing the possibility of losing his own. "Is it about that little boy?" Emily asked, following his gaze. "Mom always said you take your cases too personally." The mention of her mother made his throat tighten. "Emily, we need to talk about something important. I got some test results back." Before he could continue, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Through the door's window, he could see my parents arguing with hospital administration. My mother's voice carried clearly, "You cannot make this decision without giving God a chance to work." Emily slipped from his lap and moved to the door, watching the scene unfold. "Why don't you believe him, Dad? Remember what Mom used to say about faith." "Science doesn't work that way, honey," he replied automatically, but his voice lacked conviction. How could he explain his rigid beliefs when his own world was crumbling? A nurse appeared at his door. "Dr. Hawthorne, the ethics committee is waiting." He stood, straightening his coat. "Emily, wait here. We'll finish our talk later." "No," she said firmly, grabbing his hand. "I want to come with you. I want to see the boy who went to heaven." They walked together to the conference room, passing my hospital room where my parents knelt in prayer. Emily paused, pressing her hand against the glass. "Dad, look." For a moment, Dr. Hawthorne saw what she was pointing at, or thought he did. A soft golden light seemed to fill my room, different from the harsh fluorescent overhead lights. He blinked and it was gone. The ethics committee meeting was tense. Charts were presented, statistics quoted, resources discussed. Through it all, Dr. Hawthorne remained uncharacteristically quiet, the weight of Emily's diagnosis heavy on his heart. "Dr. Hawthorne," the committee chairman prompted, "as Alex's primary physician, we need your recommendation." He opened his mouth to deliver his prepared statement about futile care and limited resources, but Emily's small hand slipped into his under the table. In that moment, all his medical training, all his scientific certainty seemed to falter. He began, then stopped. How could he advocate for giving up on someone else's child when he wasn't ready to give up on his own? Suddenly, Emily doubled over, clutching her stomach. "Daddy, I don't feel good." The room erupted in chaos as Dr. Hawthorne's daughter collapsed. The cruel symmetry was not lost on anyone. Here was another child fighting for life in the same hospital where my fate hung in the balance. As they rushed Emily to oncology, Dr. Hawthorne found himself doing something he hadn't done since his wife died. He prayed. Not a formal prayer, not even a coherent one. Just a desperate father's plea, "Please, if you're real, don't take her too." Through my spiritual vantage point, I saw the angels gather around Emily's bed as doctors worked to stabilize her. One of them turned to me and spoke, "Now you understand why you had to stay. Some people can only find faith through their own trials." Later that night, Dr. Hawthorne sat between two hospital rooms, one where his daughter slept, beginning her battle with leukemia, and one where I lay, still suspended between life and death. The ethical dilemma he had faced with such certainty that morning now seemed impossibly complex. "Doctor," my mother's voice startled him. She stood in the hallway, her face showing nothing but compassion. "We heard about Emily. We're praying for her too." He looked at her, this woman whose faith he had dismissed so easily. "Mrs. Malarkey. Beth, how do you do it? How do you keep believing when everything seems hopeless?" She smiled gently. Because hope isn't about what we can see or prove, Dr. Hawthorne. It's about trusting that love is stronger than death, and that miracles happen not because we deserve them, but because God is gracious. As she walked away, Dr. Hawthorne looked again between the two rooms, his daughter's and mine. In that moment, something shifted in his carefully ordered world. He didn't know it yet, but his journey from skeptic to believer was about to begin, sparked by a devastating diagnosis and a 6-year-old boy who had glimpsed heaven. He picked up his phone and dialed the ethics committee chairman. About tomorrow's meeting, he said firmly, "I've changed my mind. I'm recommending we continue life support for Alex Malarkey. Some things are worth waiting for." The first words I spoke after 2 months in a coma weren't about pain or fear. They were about heaven. My eyes opened on a Tuesday morning, just as Mom was finishing her daily Bible reading beside my bed. The sunlight streaming through the window created a halo around her surprised face as I whispered, "Mommy, Jesus has your eyes." The room erupted into controlled chaos. Nurses rushed in, doctors were paged, and Dad sprinted from the cafeteria, still clutching his half-eaten sandwich. But I was calm, floating in the peace that had followed me back from my heavenly journey. "I saw you crying," I told them, my voice raspy from disuse. "When I was floating above, I wanted to tell you I was okay. The angels were holding me." Dr. Hawthorne arrived, his face a mixture of professional concern and barely concealed amazement. As he checked my vital signs, I looked at him and said something that made him freeze. "Your wife, Julie, says she's watching over Emily. She says to remember their dance at Emily's 5th birthday party." The color drained from his face. No one in the hospital knew about that private moment. How could they? It was the last time his wife had felt strong enough to dance before the cancer took her. Over the next few days, as my strength slowly returned, I began sharing more details about my experience. The hospital room became a revolving door of family, friends, and even strangers who had heard about the miracle boy who had seen heaven. "It's more real than here," I would tell them. "The colors are alive. The flowers sing. The trees dance. And the light, oh, the light. It doesn't hurt your eyes, but it fills you up inside until you feel like you might burst with joy." I described the angels in detail that left theologians stunned. "Their wings aren't just white," I explained. "They're every color at once, like when sunlight hits a soap bubble. And they don't speak with words, they speak straight to your heart. It feels like being hugged by pure love." But it was my descriptions of Jesus that moved people the most. "He has scars," I said, "but they're beautiful. They shine like gold. When he looks at you, you see yourself the way he sees you, perfectly loved, completely forgiven. In his voice, it sounds like every good thing you've ever heard, all at once." I told them about the gardens of heaven, where flowers bloomed with colors that don't exist on earth, about the music that wasn't just heard but felt, like being inside a rainbow made of sound, about the peace that wasn't just the absence of fear but the presence of perfect love. Mom recorded everything in a journal, her hands shaking as she wrote. "The grass in heaven is like tiny diamonds," I told her. "When you walk, it makes music under your feet. And everyone there is so happy, not just smiling happy, but happy all the way down to their soul." One day I described meeting Sarah, my sister who had died before I was born. "She has Mom's smile and Dad's curly hair," I said. "She told me she's been watching over us. She knows about the baby sister coming and she's so excited." My parents exchanged shocked glances. They had never told me about Sarah, and Mom hadn't announced her pregnancy to anyone yet. But I wasn't finished. "Sarah wants you to know that she felt your love, even though she was only here for 2 days. And she's not sad anymore. No one's sad in heaven." News of my recovery and my detailed descriptions of heaven spread quickly through our small town. Local papers ran headlines like "Miracle Boy Returns" with message from heaven. Church groups organized prayer meetings to hear my story. Even skeptics found themselves unable to explain how I knew things I couldn't possibly have known. Dr. Hawthorne spent hours in my room recording every detail. I noticed he had started carrying a small Bible in his coat pocket, something that would have been unthinkable just months before. "Tell me again about the light," he would say, his pen poised over his notebook. "Tell me about the peace." As my physical strength returned, the memories of heaven remained crystal clear. Unlike dreams that fade upon waking, these memories seemed to grow sharper, more vivid with each telling. "Heaven isn't up there," I would explain, pointing at the ceiling. "It's right here, just behind a thin veil. We can't see it with our eyes, but our hearts know it's there." The most powerful moments were when I shared messages from deceased loved ones. A nurse broke down crying when I told her about her brother Tommy, who had died in Vietnam. "He wants you to know he forgave you for not answering his last letter," I said. "He understands now why you couldn't." People called it a miracle, but that word seemed too small to contain the truth of what had happened. This wasn't just a story of a boy who came back from death. It was a reminder that the veil between heaven and earth is thinner than we imagine, and that love bridges even that small gap. As I grew stronger each day, the impact of my experience continued to ripple outward, touching lives in ways we never expected. But even as I shared my stories of heaven, I knew that the most extraordinary part of my journey was still to come, and that God had brought me back for a purpose that was only beginning to unfold. The story of my heavenly journey spread like wildfire. What began as whispered conversations in church hallways soon caught the attention of local media, then national networks. Our quiet family life transformed overnight as reporters camped outside our home, their cameras flashing like artificial lightning. "Boy returns from heaven with divine message," the headlines proclaimed. Local news stations ran special segments featuring interviews with my doctors, my parents, and our church members. The Today Show called. Good Morning America wanted an exclusive. Our small town paper's website crashed from the traffic when they posted my first interview. "Tell us about heaven," they would ask, microphones thrust toward my face. Mom tried to shield me from the publicity, but I felt compelled to share. "Jesus told me to tell everyone that heaven is real," I would say, "that His love is real, that no one is ever truly alone." But with the attention came the skeptics. Letters poured in, some supportive, others accusatory. Religious scholars debated the theological implications of my experience. Medical professionals offered alternative explanations: oxygen deprivation, hallucinations, the imaginative mind of a child raised in a religious household. Dr. Marcus Peterson, a prominent neurologist from Johns Hopkins, appeared on CNN declaring near-death experiences can be explained by the brain's reaction to trauma. What this boy saw was simply his mind creating comfortable illusions as it shut down. The criticism hurt my parents more than it hurt me. Dad would sit up late, reading the angry emails and opinion pieces. "How can they be so sure?" he would ask Mom. "They weren't there. They didn't see what happened to our boy." But for every skeptic, there were dozens who believed. People traveled from across the country to attend our church, hoping to hear me speak. They brought sick relatives, photos of deceased loved ones, desperate for confirmation that heaven was real, that their faith wasn't in vain. One Sunday, a woman named Margaret Davidson drove 18 hours from Montana with her terminally ill daughter. "Please," she begged, "tell me what heaven is like. I need to know where my baby is going." As I described the perfect peace and joy I had experienced, her daughter's face lit up with a smile that transformed her pain-worn features. "Mommy," she whispered, "I'm not scared anymore." The media circus intensified when I started sharing details that couldn't be explained away. I told a visiting reporter about his grandfather's secret reading spot in the attic, where he kept his favorite copy of Treasure Island, something the reporter had never told anyone about. I described to a skeptical professor the exact layout of her childhood home in Ireland, down to the crooked nail that held her mother's favorite painting. Dr. Hawthorne, once my strongest skeptic, became an unexpected ally. In a controversial interview with Medical Science Today, he stated, "As a scientist, I'm trained to trust observable evidence. And what I've observed in Alex Malarkey's case defies every medical explanation I know." His support came at a professional cost. Colleagues began to distance themselves. Some called for his license to be reviewed. But Emily's improving condition seemed to confirm his growing faith. Sometimes. He told reporters, "We have to admit that there are things beyond our current understanding." Religious leaders were divided. Some embraced my testimony as proof of their teachings, while others warned their congregations against the dangers of elevating personal experience over Scripture. Debates raged in theological journals about the validity of modern-day divine revelations. Then came the book offers. Publishers competed for the rights to my story, promising seven-figure advances. Mom and Dad were overwhelmed by the decisions they had to make. "We never wanted fame or money," Mom would say. "We just wanted to share God's message." Through it all, I continued to receive visitors in our home, now converted into an unofficial ministry center. People would wait hours just to spend a few minutes with me, hoping I could share messages from their departed loved ones or confirm their hopes about heaven. Some encounters were particularly powerful. A grieving father named James Mitchell sat with me one afternoon, clutching a photo of his son who had died in Afghanistan. Before he could speak, I said, "Tommy wants you to know he got your letter, the one you buried with him. He says the poem you wrote made him cry happy tears in heaven." Mr. Mitchell broke down. He had never told anyone about the letter he had secretly placed in his son's coffin. The story made national news, adding another layer to the growing phenomenon of my testimony. But with increased attention came increased pressure. Some days I felt overwhelmed by the expectations of others, by their desperate need for confirmation of their hopes. Mom noticed I was getting tired more easily, struggling to maintain the energy needed to meet everyone's needs. Remember, she would tell visitors gently but firmly, he's still just a little boy. Yet even as the controversy swirled and the pressure mounted, I held on to the peace I had experienced in heaven. I knew that what I had seen was real, more real than anything in this world. And I knew that sharing it, despite the challenges and criticism, was part of the purpose for which I had been sent back. One evening, as Mom tucked me into bed after a particularly long day of interviews and visitors, she asked if I ever regretted sharing my story. "No," I replied, my voice heavy with sleep. "Jesus told me that sometimes people need to see heaven through someone else's eyes before they can believe it exists. And Mommy, every time I tell someone about heaven, I get to see it again in my heart." She kissed my forehead, and as I drifted off to sleep, I could still feel the warmth of heaven's light, still hear the distant echoes of its perfect music. The controversy would continue, but I knew the truth, and sometimes that's all that matters. The tension in our small Ohio town reached its breaking point on a crisp Sunday morning in November. As our family approached Grace Community Chapel, we found the church entrance blocked by two opposing groups. On one side stood members of the Truth Seekers Alliance carrying signs that read, "Stop exploiting children and science over superstition." On the other, our church community had formed a protective circle, singing hymns. But I clutched Mom's hand tighter as angry voices filled the air. Through the chaos, I could see Dr. Hawthorne and Emily standing uncertainly at the edge of the crowd. Emily's chemotherapy had left her frail, but her eyes were bright with determination. "Fraud," someone shouted. "You're using this poor boy to make money." Dad stepped forward protectively, but before he could speak, a rock sailed through the air, shattering one of the church's stained glass windows. The sound of breaking glass seemed to freeze everyone in place. Through the broken window, I could see the figure of Jesus with his arms outstretched, now missing his face. Pastor Stevens emerged from the church, his silver hair gleaming in the morning sun. "Brothers and sisters," his voice carried across the crowd, "this is a house of God. Whatever you believe about young Alex's experience, violence has no place here." But the situation had already spiraled beyond words. The hospital board had called an emergency meeting to discuss Dr. Hawthorne's involvement in my case. Anonymous letters threatened to expose the truth about our family. Local businesses that had supported us began receiving negative reviews and threatening calls. The media descended like vultures, their cameras capturing every moment of discord. Local Miracle Divides community became the headline of the week. Reporter Janet Chin, who had once told my story with sympathy, now ran and exposed, questioning everything from our church's finances to my parents' motivations. That evening, we found our front yard covered in torn pages from Bibles, each scrawled with the word lies. Mom broke down crying when she saw her carefully tended flower garden had been destroyed. The roses she had planted to celebrate my recovery lay crushed and withered. "Why are they so angry?" I asked Dad as he cleaned up the mess. "I only told them what I saw." He paused, holding a trampled rose. "Some people are scared of things they can't explain, son. And scared people sometimes do hurtful things." The next day, the hospital announced budget cuts that specifically targeted the pediatric ward where Dr. Hawthorne worked. The message was clear: his support of my story was costing them donors. Emily's treatment would have to be transferred to another facility unless he publicly retracted his statements about my case. Our church board met in emergency session. Some members suggested it might be better if we attended a different church for a while to let things calm down. "The controversy is hurting our ministry," Deacon Williams argued. "People are leaving the congregation." But others stood firm. Mrs. Anderson, my Sunday school teacher, spoke up with tears in her eyes. "If we turn our backs on truth because it's uncomfortable, what kind of witnesses are we?" The division reached into homes and families. Tommy Baker, my best friend since kindergarten, told me his parents wouldn't let him play with me anymore. "They say you're making everything up," he whispered during recess, before running away. Through it all, I continued to share what I had seen in heaven, but now my words seemed to spark more anger than hope. People were no longer just questioning my experience, they were questioning the very foundations of faith and truth. One particularly difficult day, a reporter cornered me outside school. "Aren't you afraid of going to hell for lying?" she demanded, shoving a microphone in my face. Before I could respond, Emily appeared from nowhere, her bald head gleaming in the sun. "Leave him alone," she shouted, her weak voice carrying surprising authority. "God doesn't need you to defend him with cruelty." The image of this sick little girl defending me made national news, but not in the way anyone expected. Instead of focusing on her courage, the media spun it as a story of how the controversy is affecting innocent children. That night, as Mom tucked me into bed, I could hear Dad on the phone with our lawyer. The threats had become more serious, and there was talk of legal action against our family. Through my window, I could see people driving by slowly, taking pictures of our house. "Maybe I should stop talking about heaven," I whispered to Mom. "Maybe it would be better if everyone just forgot." She sat on the edge of my bed, her hand resting on her growing belly where my baby sister was kicking. "Alex, honey, do you remember what Jesus told you about why you came back?" I nodded, tears filling my eyes. He said people needed to know that heaven is real, that God's love is real. "And is it true? What you saw?" "Yes," I said firmly. "It's more real than anything here." She smiled, wiping away my tears. "Then we keep telling the truth no matter what. Because the truth isn't just about what you saw in heaven, it's about God's love being stronger than hate, and hope being stronger than fear." Outside, I could hear the sound of spray paint cans as someone vandalized our garage again. But for the first time since the controversy began, I felt a deep sense of peace. The same peace I had felt in heaven, where earthly troubles couldn't reach. What none of us knew then was that God was about to move in a way that would silence every critic and transform our greatest opponents into our strongest allies. The miracle that was coming would shake our town to its foundations and prove, once and for all, that heaven's truth cannot be hidden by human doubt. The turning point came on a stormy Wednesday evening during a live television debate about my story. The local news station had arranged a panel discussion featuring Dad, Dr. Hawthorne, and Professor James McKenzie, a prominent skeptic from the state university. As cameras rolled, Professor McKenzie was in the middle of dismissing my experiences as childish fantasies when I walked onto the set, unplanned and unannounced. The studio fell silent as I made my way to the center of the stage, my small frame dwarfed by the bright lights and towering cameras. "Sir, Maroon," I said, looking directly at Professor McKenzie. "Your mother Elizabeth wants you to know she forgives you. She says the argument you had the night before her stroke wasn't your fault. The blue scarf you buried with her, she knows you knitted it yourself. She found the YouTube tutorials on your computer." The color drained from his face. He had never publicly spoken about his mother's death or the guilt he carried. The scarf was a secret he'd shared with no one. His hands began to tremble as I continued. "She says the reason you don't believe in heaven is because you blame God for taking her too soon. But she wants you to know she's not in pain anymore. She dances in heaven now, just like she did before her arthritis got bad." The live broadcast captured his breakdown as he collapsed into his chair, sobbing. "How? How could you know these things?" But I wasn't finished. I turned to face each camera in turn, speaking words that seemed to flow through me rather than from me. In perfect Hebrew, a language I'd never studied, I recited ancient prayers. Then in Greek, I quoted biblical passages that scholars later confirmed hadn't been translated into English. The station's switchboard lit up with calls. Viewers reported their televisions displaying strange light patterns during my speech. Others claimed to smell flowers, roses, lilies, fragrances that reminded them of lost loved ones wafting through their living rooms. Dr. Hawthorne, who had been quietly observing, suddenly stood up. "There's something else," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Something I haven't told anyone." He pulled out his daughter's latest test results. "Emily's cancer, it's gone. Completely gone. The morning after Alex prayed with her, we did routine scans and there was no trace of disease. The studio erupted in chaos. The live feed continued to broadcast as crew members abandoned their posts, drawn into the extraordinary moment. Some fell to their knees in prayer. Others wept openly. Professor Mackenzie remained in his chair, clutching a photo of his mother he'd pulled from his wallet. Then, in what would become the most watched video clip in our town's history, something remarkable happened. As I spoke about heaven's light, the studio's electrical system began to fluctuate. Cameras captured what appeared to be a soft, golden glow emanating not from the studio lights, but from the air itself. This is what heaven's light looks like, I explained calmly. It's love made visible. For exactly 3 minutes and 33 seconds, as confirmed by multiple independent sources, every person in the studio reported feeling an overwhelming sense of peace and love. Even the most hardened skeptics couldn't deny the tangible presence that filled the room. The broadcast went viral within hours. Major networks picked up the story, not just for my revelations, but for the unexplainable phenomena captured on multiple cameras. Technical experts could find no explanation for the light anomalies or the audio recordings of what some described as heavenly harmonies playing faintly in the background. Professor Mackenzie held a press conference the next day, his academic reputation on the line, and publicly confirmed every detail I had shared about his mother. "I'm a scientist," he stated, his voice breaking. "I deal in facts and evidence, and the fact is there is no earthly way this child could have known these things." Letters poured in from viewers around the country who had experienced their own miraculous moments while watching the broadcast. A blind woman in Kansas reported temporarily regaining her sight. A deaf child in Florida said she could hear music for the first time during my Hebrew prayer. Dr. Hawthorne submitted Emily's medical records for peer review, offering irrefutable evidence of her supernatural healing. The hospital board, faced with undeniable evidence, not only retracted their threats but established a new research department dedicated to studying the intersection of faith and medicine. But perhaps the most profound impact was on our local community. The same people who had vandalized our church now came asking for forgiveness. The reporter who had questioned my honesty wrote a heartfelt retraction, sharing her own experience of smelling her late husband's cologne during the broadcast. As the sun set on that extraordinary day, I sat with Mom and Dad watching the news coverage. "Do you understand now?" I asked them. "This is why I had to come back, not just to tell people about heaven, but to show them that it's closer than they think." Mom squeezed my hand, her other hand resting on her belly where my baby sister kicked in response to all the excitement. "Heaven touched earth today," she whispered. And she was right. In that television studio, the veil between worlds had grown thin enough for everyone to feel what I had experienced during my time in heaven. It wasn't just a story anymore, it was truth made manifest, love made visible, and hope made real. The morning after the television broadcast, I found Dad's note on the kitchen table. The weight of the past months, the accident, the controversy, the threats had finally broken something inside him. "I failed to protect you," he wrote. "Maybe without me, people will leave our family alone." Mom was at her morning prayer group when I frantically called Dr. Hawthorne. Through my spiritual sight, I could see Dad standing at Miller's Bridge, staring down at the rushing waters below. The guilt of the car accident, the burden of our family's public scrutiny, and the constant attacks had pushed him to the edge, literally. "I saw what happened in the accident," he whispered to himself, tears streaming down his face. "I should have been more careful. I almost killed my own son." But what Dad didn't know was that Mom had collapsed at prayer group, clutching her stomach in pain. Our unborn sister was in distress. As ambulances raced to both locations, I felt torn between two tragedies unfolding simultaneously. Through my tears, I began to pray, "Jesus, you didn't bring me back from heaven to watch my family fall apart." That's when I saw them, the same angels who had comforted me during my time in heaven. They surrounded Dad on the bridge, though he couldn't see them. One placed a hand on his shoulder just as he stepped toward the edge. At that exact moment, a familiar voice called out, "Kevin Malarkey, don't you dare." It was Dr. Hawthorne running onto the bridge, despite his fear of heights. "Your son didn't come back from heaven to lose his father to despair." Dad turned, his eyes wild with pain. "I caused all of this. The accident, the controversy, everything. Our family was perfect before I decided to take that drive." "Perfect," Dr. Hawthorne replied, inching closer. or just quiet. Because from what I've seen, your family story has brought more hope to more people than any perfect family ever could. In the hospital, Mom was being rushed into emergency surgery. The placenta had partially detached, putting both her and the baby at risk. The doctors worked frantically to save them both while our church family filled the waiting room with prayers. Your wife and daughter need you, Dr. Hawthorne continued on the bridge. And Alex needs his father to show him that faith isn't just for the easy times. I watched through my gift of spiritual sight as the angels surrounded Dad, their light penetrating his darkness. He later told me he felt a warmth wash over him, and in that moment remembered something I had told him about heaven and heaven and heaven. I saw how God sees us, Dad. He doesn't see our mistakes, He sees our hearts. Dad stepped back from the edge and collapsed into Dr. Hawthorne's arms, sobbing. As they drove to the hospital, I saw the angels follow, their wings creating a canopy of light over the car. They arrived to find the waiting room packed with people, not just church members, but former critics, neighbors who had once shunned us, and even some of the reporters who had questioned my story. All of them praying, all of them united in hope. Hours passed. The surgery was complicated, and at one point, both Mom and the baby's hearts stopped. I could see their spirits hovering near the ceiling of the operating room, while angels sang softly nearby. But it wasn't their time, just as it hadn't been mine. When the doctor finally emerged, his scrub stained with blood but his face bright with joy, he announced that both Mom and baby Grace had survived. "It's a miracle," he said. "Medically speaking, we lost them both for almost 2 minutes." Dad, still shaking from his own crisis, fell to his knees in gratitude. Dr. Hawthorne helped him up, and together they walked to the recovery room where Mom lay, weak but smiling, with tiny Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. "I saw heaven again," Mom whispered when Dad approached. "Sarah was there. She said to tell you that God's not finished with our family story yet." That night, as our family huddled together in the hospital room, Dad holding Mom's hand, me cradling my new baby sister, and Dr. Hawthorne standing guard at the door, we understood that sometimes the deepest darkness comes just before the greatest light. What we didn't know was that our family's darkest moment was about to become the backdrop for the most extraordinary miracle yet. While our family was recovering from our own crisis, Emily Hawthorne's condition took a devastating turn. The cancer that had seemed to disappear after my prayer had returned with a vengeance, spreading more aggressively than before. I could see the light in Dr. Hawthorne's eyes dimming with each new test result. "I don't understand," he confided in Dad one evening, his voice breaking. "I believed. I finally believed. Why would God give me hope just to take it away?" The news of Emily's relapse spread through our town like wildfire, reigniting the controversy that had barely begun to settle. Critics who had been silenced by the television broadcast miracle now found their voices again. "Where's your miracle boy?" now they would shout at Dr. Hawthorne as he walked through the hospital corridors. Some even suggested that Emily's initial recovery had been staged, a desperate attempt by a grieving father to prove my story true. The division in our community deepened. The hospital chapel became a battleground between those who still believed in miracles and those who saw Emily's relapse as proof that faith was futile. One group held prayer vigils, while another demanded Dr. Hawthorne's resignation for promoting superstition over science. I visited Emily every day, watching as the disease stripped away her physical strength but failed to touch her spirit. She had decorated her hospital room with pictures of angels inspired by my descriptions of heaven. "I'm not afraid," she told me, her voice barely a whisper. "I know what's waiting for me now." Through my spiritual sight, I could see her mother's spirit hovering near, singing the lullabies that Dr. Hawthorne had forgotten. The angels remained constant, their wings creating a shimmer in the air that even the nurses sometimes noticed, though they attributed it to the fluorescent lighting. One particularly difficult evening, as Emily's fever spiked dangerously high, I overheard 2 doctors talking outside her room. "Hawthorne's lost his objectivity completely," one said. "First the malarkey boy, now his own daughter. He's letting grief cloud his judgment." "The board's meeting tomorrow," the other replied. "They're voting on whether to revoke his privileges." That night, our church family gathered for an emergency prayer meeting. But instead of unity, we found conflict. Some blamed Dr. Hawthorne for supporting my story, suggesting it had somehow invited divine punishment. Others defended him fiercely, nearly coming to blows with their opponents. Pastor Stephen stood at the pulpit, his silver hair seeming to have whitened overnight. "Have we forgotten so quickly?" he asked. "Have we forgotten that faith isn't about getting what we want, but trusting God even when we don't understand?" But understanding seemed far away that night. The local news vans parked outside the church captured the sad spectacle of believers arguing with believers while Emily fought for her life in a stark hospital room. Dr. Hawthorne spent his nights in a chair beside Emily's bed, reading medical journals and praying in alternating breaths. The man who had once dismissed faith as a crutch now clung to it like a lifeline, even as it seemed to slip through his fingers. "I saw Mom again," Emily told me during one of my visits, her eyes bright with fever. "She was wearing the blue dress from your description of heaven, the one I'd never seen before. She said everything's happening exactly as it should." The community's division reached its peak when someone broke into the hospital chapel and destroyed the prayer request box containing hundreds of cards for Emily. The security cameras caught images of respected church members in the act, people who had decided that destroying faith was better than wrestling with doubt. Through it all, I kept seeing glimpses of heaven's perspective, how these moments of deepest darkness were actually setting the stage for something extraordinary. But when I tried to share this, few wanted to listen. They were too caught up in their own fears and doubts. As Emily grew weaker, Dr. Hawthorne's faith was tested in ways that made Job's trials seem simple. Yet every night he would still whisper to his sleeping daughter, "God isn't finished with our story yet." He was right, though not in the way any of us expected. Because sometimes when God writes a story, he saves the most amazing plot twist for what seems like the final chapter. The night of the hospital board meeting, when they were set to vote on Dr. Hawthorne's privileges, Emily slipped into a coma. Her vital signs were failing, and the oncology team had given her hours, maybe minutes, to live. Dr. Hawthorne stood by her bed, his medical expertise useless in the face of his daughter's imminent death. Through my spiritual sight, I saw something extraordinary beginning to unfold. The same light that had filled the television studio weeks before started to gather in Emily's room. Angels positioned themselves at each corner of her bed, their wings creating a canopy of shimmering gold above her. "Dr. Hawthorne," I whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "Look up." He raised his tear-stained face, and for the first time I saw him see what I could see. His eyes widened as the veil between worlds grew thin enough for human eyes to perceive heaven's reality. There, standing at the foot of Emily's bed, was his wife Julie, radiant in the blue dress Emily had described. "She's real," he gasped, reaching out trembling hands. "You're real." Julie smiled, and though no audible words were spoken, Dr. Hawthorne later said he heard her voice clearly in his heart. "It's time to let go of doubt, Richard. Not everything needs a scientific explanation." The monitors tracking Emily's vital signs began to behave erratically. Nurses rushed in but stopped short at the doorway, transfixed by the scene before them. The room filled with a fragrance that everyone present would later describe differently. Roses, ocean breeze, morning dew, but all would agree it was the sweetest thing they'd ever smelled. Emily's body began to glow with a soft light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with her failing heart. Dr. Hawthorne fell to his knees beside her bed, and for the first time since his wife's death, he prayed with complete abandonment to logic and reason. "God," he sobbed, "I believe. I don't understand, but I believe." At that moment, Emily's eyes flew open. The light that had been surrounding her seemed to pour into her, filling her from within. Color flooded back into her cheeks, and the monitors suddenly showed strong, steady readings. "Daddy," she said clearly, sitting up in bed. "I saw Mom. And I saw what Alex saw. Heaven is so beautiful." Dr. Hawthorne, still on his knees, watched in amazement as Emily pulled out her IV tubes and stood up, stronger than she had been in months. The nurses frantically called for additional doctors, who rushed in with portable scanning equipment. What they found defied every medical explanation. The cancer was gone, not just in remission, but completely absent. Every trace of the disease had vanished from her body. Even the damage from chemotherapy had been reversed. As news of Emily's miraculous healing spread through the hospital, the board meeting meant to decide Dr. Hawthorne's fate transformed into something else entirely. Instead of voting on his dismissal, they found themselves witnessing his testimony. standing before his colleagues, many of whom had ridiculed his support of my story, Dr. Hawthorne spoke with the authority of both a scientist and a believer. I've spent my career searching for logical explanations, dismissing anything that couldn't be proven in a lab. But tonight I experienced something that can't be measured by our instruments or explained by our theories. The next morning, Dr. Hawthorne called a press conference. The same reporters who had once questioned my story now gathered to hear him declare, as a medical professional, I can no longer deny the reality of divine intervention. I've seen it with my own eyes, and my daughter is living proof. Emily stood beside him, radiant with health, her previously bald head now covered with a soft down of new hair. When asked about her experience, she simply smiled and said, "Heaven is more real than here." Alex was right all along. That evening, as our families gathered in the hospital chapel, no longer for desperate prayers, but for joyful thanksgiving, Dr. Hawthorne pulled me aside. "I'm sorry I ever doubted you," he said softly. Sometimes the greatest miracles happen when we finally stop trying to explain them. The chapel filled with people, doctors, nurses, former skeptics, and believers alike, all united in witnessing what happens when heaven touches earth. And as we sang hymns of praise, I saw angels joining in, their voices creating harmonies that made the stained glass windows vibrate with joy. The impact of Emily's miraculous healing rippled through our community like a stone cast into still water. What began as one girl's recovery soon multiplied into something far greater. People who had witnessed the event in the hospital began experiencing their own miracles. Mrs. Thompson, who had been wheelchair-bound for 15 years, felt a warmth similar to what had filled Emily's room while attending church the following Sunday. Before the congregation's astonished eyes, she stood up and walked to the altar. Her doctor later confirmed that her multiple sclerosis had completely vanished. I found myself able to see more clearly than ever before, not just glimpses of heaven, but the way heaven was constantly reaching out to touch earth. Angels moved freely through hospital corridors, their presence bringing comfort even to those who couldn't see them. I began sharing more specific messages, not just about heaven in general, but personal words of hope for individuals. "Your daughter forgives you," I told Mr. Anderson, our church's most vocal skeptic. "The accident wasn't your fault. She wants you to know she chose to push her friend out of the car's way. It was her choice, not your failure." He broke down crying, revealing a secret he'd carried for 20 years about his daughter's death. The weight of guilt that had kept him from believing in a loving God finally lifted. Cancer patients in Dr. Hawthorne's ward began reporting unexpected recoveries. The head of oncology ordered a study when remission rates in our hospital climbed to 3 times the national average. They found that the rooms where I had visited showed the highest rates of recovery. One morning I felt compelled to visit the psychiatric ward. There I found Sarah Mitchell, a teenage girl who hadn't spoken since witnessing her family's murder 6 months earlier. As I entered her room, I saw an angel gently stroking her hair. "Your family wants you to know they're okay," I told her. "They don't want you to stay silent anymore. Your testimony will help catch the person who hurt them." Sarah spoke for the first time in months, providing details that would later lead to the arrest of her family's killer. The detective assigned to the case became one of our strongest supporters after Sarah revealed information she couldn't possibly have known through natural means. The media returned, but this time with a different attitude. Instead of seeking scandal, they came looking for hope. Stories of healing and restoration began to replace the earlier skepticism and controversy. Even the scientific community took notice. Dr. Hawthorne collaborated with researchers from major universities to document and study the phenomena occurring in our town. While they couldn't explain the healings, they couldn't deny them either. "We're seeing cellular regeneration that defies every known medical principle," one researcher reported. "It's as if someone rewrote the biological code in these patients." But the most profound impact wasn't in the physical healings, it was in the healing of hearts and relationships. People who had been bitter enemies during the height of the controversy found themselves drawn together by shared experiences of grace. The reporter who had once tried to discredit our family became one of our closest friends after her autistic son spoke his first words during one of our prayer meetings. "Love you, Mommy," he said clearly after years of silence. Our church, once divided by doubt, united in purpose. The prayer room stayed open 24 hours a day, filled with people seeking not just physical healing but spiritual restoration. The presence of heaven became so tangible that visitors often reported seeing soft light or smelling unexplainable sweet fragrances. Throughout it all, I continued sharing the message Jesus had given me. Heaven's reality is closer than you think, and God's love is bigger than your doubts. One evening, as I watched the sunset from our front porch, I saw angels dancing in the golden light. They were celebrating every heart that opened to hope, every life touched by heaven's reality. Mom came out and sat beside me, baby Grace sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Do you see them?" she asked softly. "Yes," I replied. "They're always here. We just forget to look." The miracles continued, each one a reminder that my journey to heaven wasn't just about one boy's experience. It was about showing everyone that the veil between heaven and earth is thinner than we imagine, and that God's love can reach through any darkness to bring healing and hope. 10 years have passed since my journey to heaven, and our small Ohio town has never been the same. I stand at the pulpit of Grace Community Chapel, now as its youngest pastor at 16, looking out at faces that tell stories of transformation. Emily Hawthorne sits in the front row, her long hair now fully restored, beside her father. Dr. Hawthorne divides his time between his medical practice and leading the hospital's new Center for Spiritual Healing, where science and faith work together to understand God's miracles. Their story has inspired thousands of others to bridge the gap between medicine and spirituality. My sister Grace, now 10, possesses a gift similar to mine. She sees angels too, though she experiences them differently. Sometimes during services, she'll quietly point out the heavenly beings that move among the congregation, bringing comfort and healing to those in need. Mom and Dad sit together, their hands clasped tightly. The scars from Dad's dark night on Miller's Bridge have faded, replaced by a deep understanding that God uses our deepest wounds to help others heal. He now leads support groups for fathers struggling with guilt and faith, while Mom's prayer ministry has become a beacon of hope for troubled families. The church itself has evolved. What was once a traditional sanctuary now welcomes people from all walks of life. The broken stained glass window from that tumultuous Sunday was replaced with a new design, a boy reaching between heaven and earth, surrounded by angels. Visitors often say they feel peace the moment they step inside. My role as pastor isn't what most people expect. I share heaven's reality not through traditional sermons, but through stories of ongoing miracles and real-time messages from the spiritual realm. During services, I often pause to relay messages from departed loved ones or describe the angels I see ministering to specific individuals. Professor McKenzie, once my strongest critic, now teaches a course at the State University called The Science of Spiritual Experiences. He sits near the back every Sunday, taking notes not to disprove, but to document what he calls the ongoing intersection of heaven and earth. The miracles haven't stopped. If anything, they've become more frequent as more people open their hearts to possibility. Last week, a paralyzed veteran walked for the first time in 15 years. Yesterday, a mother with terminal cancer received news that her disease had inexplicably vanished. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation is in how our community views faith itself. It's no longer about rigid beliefs or proving points, it's about experiencing God's love in tangible ways. The divide between believers and skeptics has been replaced by a shared sense of wonder at the mysteries we witness regularly. Sarah, my sister in heaven, still visits occasionally. I see her standing near the altar, smiling as she watches Grace playing after services. Our family circle remains unbroken, stretching between heaven and earth, a living testimony to God's promise that love transcends all boundaries. Looking out at my congregation, I'm reminded of what Jesus told me during my brief time in heaven. Every life is a story of God's love being written. Our town's story continues to unfold, one miracle at a time. As I conclude my story, I'm reminded of something Jesus told me during my time in heaven. Love is the bridge between worlds. 10 years later, I understand more deeply what he meant. It's not just about the extraordinary experiences I had, but about how heaven's love continues to transform ordinary lives every day. The truth about heaven isn't just that it exists, it's that it's closer than we think. Every act of kindness, every moment of forgiveness, every instance of healing is a glimpse of heaven touching earth. I've watched hardened skeptics become believers not through arguments or proof, but through experiencing God's love in tangible ways. Dr. Hawthorne often says that the greatest miracle isn't that his daughter was healed, but that his heart was transformed. Science can explain how things work, he tells his medical students, but only love can explain why they matter. My family's journey has taught us that faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting that even in our darkest moments, like Dad's night on the bridge or Mom's dangerous pregnancy, God's love never lets go. The scars from our trials have become bridges for others to cross from doubt to belief. The messages I continue to receive from heaven share a common theme: God's love is bigger than our fears, stronger than our doubts, and deeper than our pain. When people ask me what heaven is like, I tell them to look for its reflections here in the eyes of a forgiving friend, in the touch of a healing hand, in the wonder of a child's faith. Emily, now cancer-free for a decade, leads youth groups where she teaches others that miracles aren't just stories from the past, they're promises for today. Heaven isn't waiting for us, she says. It's reaching for us in every moment. Grace, my little sister who almost didn't make it into this world, now helps me identify angels during services. She reminds me that the next generation will see even greater things, as the veil between heaven and earth grows thinner through believing hearts. To those who still doubt, I share what Jesus showed me: heaven's reality doesn't depend on our belief, but our experience of it does. Every time someone opens their heart to possibility, another window opens between worlds. The miracles continue, not because we deserve them, but because love can't help but flow where faith creates a channel. Our town has become a testimony to this truth as people from around the world come to witness what happens when heaven's reality becomes earth's experience. My sister Sarah, watching from heaven with our heavenly family, rejoices as each new soul discovers the truth I was sent back to share: that God's love transcends death, bridges worlds, and transforms lives. This is the message heaven wanted me to bring back: not just that it exists, but that it's reaching for us in every moment, inviting us to see beyond our limited perspective to the infinite possibilities of divine love. For in the end, heaven isn't just a place we go when we die, it's the reality of God's love breaking into our world, one miracle at a time. If this story of heaven's reality has touched your heart, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences and reflections could inspire others on their spiritual journey. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful testimonies of faith, and remember to hit the like button to help spread this message of hope. Share this video with loved ones who might need a reminder that heaven is real and God's love never fails. Together we can create a community of believers supporting each other's faith journeys. Thank you for being part of this miraculous story.